My name is Sergeant Milan Duffy, and at 30 years old, after 2 deployments to places that maps don't bother to name, I thought I understood the definition of an enemy. I was wrong. The real enemy was sitting across from me, right at the welcome home dinner table in Missoula, Montana. After I'd just handed my father, Pedro, a custom-engraved combat knife I'd brought back from Germany, he placed it down next to his steak. He didn't look at it. He looked through me, and in that command voice he always used, he declared, "Milan, you have 48 hours. Get your things and get out of your brother's house." My brother, the one chasing big dreams in New York, hadn't set foot here in years. I had poured my entire savings, $60,000, into keeping this place alive, paying off the bank loans, replacing the leaking roof, buying every single piece of furniture in this dining room. And now they were just giving it to him. My mother, Grace, silently stood up and began clearing my plate, even though I was only halfway done. That single act was crueler than any words. In her eyes, I no longer existed here. They thought they were giving an order to a daughter. They forgot their daughter is a sergeant. And in the Army, we have a code. You never leave a soldier behind, even when that soldier is you. Before I get into my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been the one to sacrifice everything for family, only to realize you were the first one they'd leave behind. The air in the dining room was thick with the smell of grilled steak and my own foolish hope. It was a familiar scent, the one my mom always orchestrated for a celebration. Tonight, it was supposed to be for me. Welcome home, Sergeant Duffy. The table was set with the good china, the same plates we used for Thanksgiving and Christmas. It all looked so normal, so American. A picture of a family reunited, but pictures lie. I'd been holding the gift in my lap, a small heavy box wrapped in plain brown paper. My pulse was a steady, hopeful drum against my wrist. This was more than a souvenir. This was a bridge. A peace offering. I had spent weeks of my per diem in Germany searching for it, finally finding it in a small shop in Solingen, a place famous for its steel. A Boker combat knife. The handle was polished oak, smooth and warm to the touch. The blade was matte black, sharp enough to sever bone. It felt solid, dependable. It felt like everything I thought my father was. I brought you something, Dad," I said, my voice sounding strangely thin in the quiet room. I slid the box across the polished oak table. It stopped just short of his plate. Pedro looked at it, then at me, his expression unreadable. He picked it up, weighed it in his calloused hands, and slowly lifted the lid. The knife lay nestled in black velvet. I held my breath. I had paid extra to have the blade engraved. It was a simple, heartfelt line. For the greatest father. He took the knife out, his thick fingers clumsy against the hilt. He tested the edge with his thumb, a slight, almost imperceptible nod acknowledging the craftsmanship. For a single fleeting second, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe he'd see me. Then he placed it on the table with a soft, final click. It wasn't a sound of reverence, it was the sound of dismissal, the way you'd set down a piece of junk mail. He nudged it with his pinky finger, pushing it next to the salt shaker, as if it were a useless paperweight. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even look at the engraving. He just grunted, his eyes fixed on some point over my shoulder. "What's this for?" The question wasn't one of curiosity. It was an accusation. "What is the purpose of this gesture? What do you want from me?" The hope in my chest deflated, leaving a cold, hollow ache. The first cut. It was always the quietest one that hurt the most. I swallowed, the bite of steak in my mouth suddenly turning to ash. It's just a gift, Dad." He ignored me, turning his attention back to his food. The silence that followed was a living thing. It filled the space between us, suffocating. I could hear the scrape of his fork against his plate, the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, the frantic beat of my own heart. My mother, Grace, said nothing. She just kept her eyes on her own plate, a willing accomplice to the silence. Finally, Pedro pushed his empty plate away and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked at me then, truly, looked at me, and his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. This was it, the briefing, the part where the mission objective is laid out, clear and brutal. Milan, he began, his voice the low growl of a man used to being obeyed. You have 48 hours. Get your things and get out of your brother's house. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning. 48 hours, brother's house. My brain, trained to process commands under fire, tried to make sense of the sequence. It was a tactical order delivered in a domestic setting, an eviction. Why? The word escaped my lips, barely a whisper. It was a stupid question. In the army, you don't ask why. You execute the command. But this wasn't the army. This was my home, or so I thought. Pedro scoffed, a nasty, dismissive sound. Colt's the son. He needs to get established, set down roots. You're a soldier. Here one day, gone the next. You don't need a home. The logic was so twisted, so profoundly cruel, it almost made me laugh. He wasn't just taking away the house I'd paid for. He was stripping me of my role, my gender, my very identity outside of a uniform. I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was a transient, a wanderer with no claim to the land I stood on. As I sat there, stunned into silence, a movement caught my eye. It was my mother. Grace rose from her chair with a quiet, practiced grace. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at my father. Her eyes were fixed on my plate. She walked around the table, and with a steady hand, she picked up my dinner. The steak still bleeding pink, the mashed potatoes barely touched. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her actions screamed what her voice was too cowardly to say. Your meal is over. You are no longer welcome at this table. You are done here. It was the most passive, most devastating act of cruelty I had ever witnessed. A symbolic erasure. That's when the training kicked in. The shock receded, replaced by a cold, clear calm. The emotional response was compartmentalized, locked away for later. I was no longer a daughter. I was Sergeant Duffy, assessing a hostile situation. I stood up, my chair making no sound on the thick rug. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My gaze moved with methodical precision. First, to the knife on the table, the rejected peace offering. Then to the empty chair where my brother, Colt, should have been, the ghost whose entitlement had just rendered me homeless. Finally, to the blank, unfeeling eyes of my parents, the enemy command. I gave a single, sharp nod, the kind I'd give a superior officer. Roger, I said. My voice was level, devoid of emotion. It was the tone of a soldier acknowledging a direct order. They thought it was submission. They saw a daughter obeying. They were wrong. In my head, a different voice, my own voice, was speaking. Mission accepted. Objective. Reclaim everything. I turned to leave the room, and my eyes fell to my own hands. I looked at my palms, the faint calluses still there from the last time I was on leave, the time I'd spent retiling the bathroom floor. I remembered the feel of the hammer in my grip as I repaired the fence, the sting of cold Montana air on my knuckles as I fixed the shingles on the roof. These were the hands of a builder, a maintainer, a protector. Slowly, deliberately, I felt my fingers curl inward. I watched my knuckles turn white. I felt the pressure build until my hands, the ones that had served and sustained this house, were two tight, shaking fists. The mission had changed. The builder was now a demolition expert, and my first target was their world. Back in my room, or what used to be my room, the silence was different. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the dinner table. This was a hollow silence, an echo chamber for the ghosts of my own loyalty. My father's words, "You don't need a home," bounced off the bare walls. It was then that the first memory hit me, not as a gentle wave, but as a full-force sandstorm, gritty and blinding. The memory tasted of dust and fear. I was at Forward Operating Base Shank, in Afghanistan's Logar province. The air was a constant haze of kicked-up dirt, so fine it got into your teeth. The call from my mother had come in on the expensive sat phone, the one that cost $7 a minute. Her voice was frantic, a high-pitched whine of panic that could cut through the static of 10,000 miles. The bank called again, Milan. They said they're going to start foreclosure proceedings. I could picture her perfectly, standing in the kitchen, twisting a dish towel in her hands. Mom, breathe. I told you I'd handle it. But they need the money now. Pedro, he lost his pension money again. The horses, Milan, he just won't stop. Before I could answer, the world outside my small plywood office erupted in a series of ear-splitting shrieks. Whoop! 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 The rocket attack siren. The disembodied voice over the camp's loudspeakers was unnervingly calm. Incoming! 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 Instinct took over. My body tensed, my training screaming at me to drop everything and run for the nearest concrete bunker. Through the phone, I could hear shouting on my end. Duffy, let's go, move. It was Sergeant Miller, my team leader. Mom, I have to go, I yelled over the siren's wail. No, wait, she shrieked, her panic drowning out the sirens in my ear. You don't understand, we'll lose the house. Her desperation was a physical weight, pinning me to the spot. Outside, boots were pounding on the gravel paths. The first distant thump of an impact shook the ground. They were walking the rockets in, getting closer. Miller was at my door now. Duffy, what the hell are you doing? That's an order. I held up one finger to him, an insane gesture in the middle of a rocket attack. I turned my back, shielding the phone as if that could protect our conversation from the war zone. With my free hand, I was already logging into my online banking app on my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The connection was slow, agonizing. Each buffering wheel was a lifetime. Mom, I'm sending it now, I shouted, my voice raw. The whole thing, $60,000, it's all my hazard pay, everything I have. Another thump, closer this time. The windows of my office rattled in their frames. Miller grabbed the back of my fatigues. That's it, I'm dragging you out of here. The transfer confirmation screen finally loaded. I stabbed the confirm button with my finger. It's done, Mom. It's sent, I screamed into the phone. The line was already dead. Miller yanked me backwards, pulling me out the door and shoving me towards the ground just as a deafening explosion ripped through the air nearby. Dirt and gravel rained down on us. As I lay there, face pressed into the dirt, heart hammering against my ribs, all I could think was, the house is safe. I had risked my life, literally, for that house. For them. The sandstorm of memory shifted. The dust of Afghanistan replaced by the damp, musty smell of the attic back in Missoula. It was 2 years prior, during a 2-week leave. A classic Montana autumn storm had torn a new leak in the roof. Instead of relaxing, I spent my days in the cold, cramped attic space, balancing on wooden beams, surrounded by forgotten Christmas decorations and the ghosts of my childhood. The cold seeped through my jeans, into my bones, but I didn't stop until I found and patched every last leak. While I worked, my back aching and my hands covered in tar, I could hear my mother downstairs on the phone with Colt. Her voice, so often flat and weary with me, was a song of pride. Oh, your art is just getting so profound, honey, an exhibit in a New York gallery. Your father and I are so proud. A gallery. It sounded so important. I felt a small, stupid pang of pride for him myself. I found out later, through a cousin, that the gallery was a corner in a Starbucks in Brooklyn where they let him hang 3 of his canvases for a week. No one bought anything. That was the pattern. I was the fixer. He was the dreamer. I was the one who dealt with the ugly, practical realities, the leaky roofs, the maxed-out credit cards, the foreclosure notices. Colt was the one who got to have passion. My sacrifices were simply the fuel for his fantasies. It became clear the time I discovered a series of small, odd charges on my emergency credit card, the one I'd left at home strictly for household repairs. $100 at a fancy steakhouse, $50 at a liquor store, $200 at a poker website. I called home, my stomach tight with anger. When I confronted my mother, her response wasn't anger at Colt. It was annoyance at me. He probably just needed it, Milan, she'd said, her voice laced with a familiar weariness. Don't make things difficult for your brother. You're the older sister. You have to be forgiving. They had raised me on a diet of responsibility and duty, but Colt was exempt from it all. His irresponsibility was repackaged as my burden. My duty was to enable him. My role was to be the silent, dependable machine that kept the family afloat while the golden boy played. The final memory was the sharpest. A phone call just before my last deployment. Colt, asking for $5,000. It's an investment, Milan. A real opportunity this time. I was tired of the lies, the excuses. No, Colt, I'm not giving you any more money. What happened to the money from the last investment? His voice, usually so smooth and charming, turned ugly. What would you know about passion? He spat. You're just a robot in a uniform, following orders. Don't you dare lecture me about life. The insult stung, but it was what I heard next that truly broke something inside me. In the background, faint but unmistakable, was my father's voice. He wasn't defending me. He was coaching my brother. Just ignore her, son. A robot in a uniform. That's all I was to them. A machine that produced money and solved problems. A thing to be used, not a daughter to be loved. And I have to ask you, have you ever felt like that? Like your sacrifices meant nothing, and your family saw you not as a person, but as a function, a tool? If you know what that feels like, hit the like button to show some support for Milan, and just comment the word robot below. Let's see how many of us have been there. Sitting in the wreckage of my old room, the ghosts of these memories swirled around me. The robot was finally seeing the truth. $60,000. What did I really buy with it? I hadn't bought them a house. I'd bought them a cage where they could coddle their failures. I'd bought my own eviction notice. And most of all, I'd bought this one, singular moment of absolute, soul-crushing clarity. Sleep never came. The darkness was a heavy blanket, offering no rest, only a space for the previous night's scene to play on a loop. My father's command, my mother's betrayal, the cold finality of it all. The pain was a physical presence, a pressure behind my eyes. The old Milan, the daughter, would have surrendered. She would have curled up and let the grief win. But the daughter was gone. The sergeant was on duty. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I refused to allow another minute of weakness. In a combat zone, after a mission goes sideways, you don't fall apart. You secure the area. You restore order. Chaos is the enemy, and discipline is your weapon. My feet hit the cold hardwood floor. First objective, sanitize the operational area. I started with myself. The shower was brutally cold, a deliberate shock to the system meant to chase away the fog of exhaustion. I let the icy water cascade over me until my skin tingled and my thoughts felt sharp. Back in my room, I bypassed my civilian clothes and reached for a fresh set of Army combat uniforms. I was on leave, with no reason to wear them. But it wasn't about reason, it was about reclaiming my identity. As I buttoned the blouse and bloused my boots, I could feel the transformation. The stiff, familiar fabric was my armor. The person staring back at me from the mirror was no longer a discarded daughter. She was a non-commissioned officer of the United States Army. She had a spine of steel. Next, the room. I stripped the bed, folding the sheets with military precision. I dusted every surface, aligned every book. I wasn't just cleaning. I was taking control of the one small piece of territory I had left. I was imposing order on the chaos. When I finished, the room was sterile, impersonal, ready for evacuation. I couldn't stay in that house. It was hostile territory. I grabbed my keys and left without a word. I drove until the neighborhood faded in the rearview mirror, ending up at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town called the Bighorn. It smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease, with cracked red vinyl booths. It was perfect, anonymous. I slid into a booth in the corner. A waitress with tired eyes took my order. Just coffee, black? When she brought it, I took a sip. It was bitter and burnt, but it was hot and real. Staring into the black liquid, the question from the night before returned. $60,000. What did I really buy with it? That question was the mission prompt. The anger and grief were just noise. To win, I needed to silence the noise and focus on the objective. I needed a plan. I pulled a flimsy napkin from the metal dispenser and uncapped a pen. This would be my sand table. At the top, I wrote in clean block letters, Operation Reclamation. Turning a personal catastrophe into a military campaign had a clarifying effect. It stripped the emotion away, leaving only strategy. I laid out my objectives. Primary objective, secure justice and recover assets. Secondary objective, expose the truth. Simple, measurable, achievable. Then I broke it down into phases, the same way I would plan a route clearance mission. Phase 1, Intel Recon, gather intelligence. Phase 2, fortify alliances, secure support. Phase 3, asset extraction, recover my property. Phase 4, full-scale legal assault, the final attack. I stared at the words scribbled on the napkin. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a map out of hell. I looked up from my plan and out the large plate glass window. The morning rush was starting. A family piled out of a minivan at the gas station across the street, a dad laughing as he swung his little daughter in a circle, a mom trying to herd their son. They looked so happy, so normal. In that moment, the weight of my isolation crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. A wave of profound loneliness washed over me, so intense it made my chest ache. I was completely, utterly alone. No one was coming to save me. My own command structure had designated me as expendable. The coffee cup trembled in my hand. I felt the hot sting of tears behind my eyes, the first I'd allowed myself to feel. The sergeant was faltering. The wall of discipline was about to crack. But then, a quote surfaced in my mind, something I had read years ago, tacked to the wall of my barracks. It was from Theodore Roosevelt. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. I pulled out my phone, found the full speech, and read it right there in the diner booth. The words were a lifeline. I wasn't a critic on the sidelines. I wasn't a victim to be pitied. I was in the arena. My face was marred by the dust of their betrayal, the sweat of my labor, and the blood of my emotional wounds. And the credit, the victory, belonged to the one who was willing to fight. I wasn't a victim. I was a combatant. I took a deep, steadying breath. The tears receded. The resolve hardened. It was time to fight. My plan on the napkin was the strategy. Roosevelt's words were the fuel. Phase 1, Intel Recon. The first step in any operation is to know your enemy's position. I needed to see the battlefield clearly. Calling a lawyer was an attack. That would come later. This was reconnaissance. It required subtlety. My mind cycled through contacts, stopping on one name, Finn Walsh. We'd gone to high school together here in Missoula. Not a close friend, but I knew he was smart, and more importantly, I knew where he worked. He was a loan manager at First Montana Bank, the same bank that held the mortgage on the house. I pulled up his number and pressed call, my heart a steady drum. He answered on the third ring. Walsh. Finn, it's Milan Duffy. There was a pause, then recognition. Duffy. Wow, long time. Heard you were back in town. How's it going? I cut through the pleasantries. Time was a resource I couldn't afford to waste. I'm good. Listen, Finn, I'm calling because I need a favor. A big one, and it needs to be completely off the record. The line was quiet. Okay, he said, his tone shifting from friendly to cautious. I'm listening. I suspect there's been some unusual activity on my credit profile, specifically related to my home address, I said, my voice calm and professional. I need to know if any new lines of credit or loans have been taken out in my name against that property in the last year. Can you run a discreet check for me? I didn't whine or tell him my sob story. I presented it as a security concern, a potential breach. It was a language he, as a banker, would understand. This was my first probe into enemy lines, a single scout sent to map the minefield. I had no idea what I would find, but I knew one thing for certain. The battle had begun. The hours after my call to Finn were the longest of my life. I left the diner and drove to a small, cheap motel off the highway, a clean, anonymous room with a lumpy bed and a television bolted to the wall. I couldn't go back to the house. It was compromised territory. I sat on the edge of the bed, my phone face up on the scratchy floral bedspread, and waited. Every car that passed on the interstate outside sounded like it was pulling into the parking lot. Every distant phone ring felt like it was mine. In the military, waiting is part of the job. You wait for orders, you wait for transport, you wait for the enemy to make a move. You learn to manage the tension, to keep your mind occupied with weapon maintenance or gear checks. But this was different. There were no drills to run, no rifle to clean. There was only the gnawing uncertainty and the cold, hard knot in my stomach. I was waiting for a single piece of intelligence that would either confirm my worst fears or tell me I was losing my mind. When my phone finally buzzed against the bedspread, the name Finn Walsh lighting up the screen, my heart leaped into my throat. I took a steadying breath before answering, forcing my voice to be level. Duffy. Milan. Finn's voice was low, tight with a tension that hadn't been there before. You need to sit down for this. I was already sitting. I'm sitting, Finn. What did you find? He hesitated, and I could hear the faint sound of him taking a deep breath. Okay, so, this is highly irregular, and if anyone asks, this conversation never happened. But I remember when you enlisted, the whole town was proud. My dad cut your picture out of the Mausoleum and put it on the fridge. You're one of ours, Milan. I couldn't just let this go. His words were a small, unexpected warmth in the cold room, but they also confirmed that whatever he'd found was bad. Thank you, Finn. Just tell me. 6 months ago, he began, his voice dropping even lower. A second mortgage was taken out on your parents' property. The loan amount was for $60,000. The knot in my stomach turned to ice. A second mortgage? Yes. With you, Sergeant Milan Duffy, listed as the primary borrower. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was one thing to have your money stolen. It was another thing entirely to have your name, your identity, your very essence, stolen and forged. Finn, how is that possible? I was in Germany. They had your documents, Milan, he said, and I could hear the anger in his voice now. A copy of your military ID, your social security number, everything. And they had your signature on the loan application. It's all here in the file. I stared at the peeling paint on the motel room wall. They hadn't just taken my deployment money. They had used my spotless credit score, a score built on years of discipline and fiscal responsibility, to commit fraud. They had weaponized my honor. The trust the system extends to a soldier on active duty. They had twisted it into a tool for their own greed. Thank you, Finn, I managed to say, my voice a hollow whisper. You have no idea what this means. Be careful, Milan, he said before hanging up. This is a deep hole. He was right, but I was a combat engineer. Deep holes were my specialty. The moment the call ended, my training kicked in. The shock was a wave, but I didn't let it drown me. I rode it, letting it sharpen my focus. I immediately dialed my next contact. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Riley. Jess Riley's voice was as sharp and precise as she was. We'd served together before she left the army to become a lawyer. She'd been a military intelligence officer, and she still thought like one. Jess, it's Milan. I'm sending you an email. I need your eyes on it, now. What's the situation? She asked, no pleasantries. Potential identity theft, bank fraud, federal level. Sending now, I said, forwarding the informal summary Finn had texted me. I heard the click of her keyboard. The silence on the line stretched for a full minute. I knew she was analyzing it, dissecting the information, gaming out the scenarios. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold steel. This isn't a family dispute anymore, Milan, she said. This is a federal crime. By using your military status to secure the loan, they've crossed a dozen red lines. Bank fraud, aggravated identity theft. You have full authorization to act. This isn't revenge. This is about enforcing the law. Her words were the official sanction I needed. Jess wasn't just my friend, she was my legal counsel, my strategist. Her assessment gave me the moral and legal high ground. I need hard evidence, Milan, she continued. A paper trail, anything you can find in that house that connects them to this loan. Can you get back in? I have 24 hours left on my eviction notice, I said. I can get in. That night, under the cover of darkness, I returned to the house. I parked down the street and approached on foot, moving through the familiar shadows of my childhood neighborhood. The lights were off. Pedro and Grace were asleep. I used my key to slip in the back door, my boots silent on the linoleum floor. The house felt alien, hostile. My target was the attic. It was cold up there, smelling of dust and decaying memories. I ignored the boxes of old photos and childhood drawings. I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was on a search and destroy mission for the enemy's weapons. With the beam of my tactical flashlight, I scanned the cluttered space. My parents were messy, but my father was predictably lazy. He would have hidden it somewhere obvious. I moved to a stack of old Christmas decoration boxes. Tucked behind them was a plain cardboard box marked Old Tax Records. I sliced the tape with my pocket knife. Inside, beneath years of receipts and old W-2s, was a large manila folder. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out. My name was written on the tab in my mother's familiar cursive. I opened it, and there it was. The original loan document from First Montana Bank. And at the bottom, a clumsy, awkward forgery of my signature. Behind it were the bank statements, showing the $60,000 deposit, followed by a series of large withdrawals. And tucked in the very back were the delinquency notices from the bank. They hadn't even bothered to make the payments on the loan they'd stolen in my name. The full picture snapped into focus, cold and brutal and clear. Colt, the failed artist, had come home, broke and defeated. Pedro's gambling debts were likely piling up. They needed a bailout, and I was it. They had conspired to use my identity to drain the equity from the house and then issued me an eviction order to get me, the sole obstacle and rightful heir to that money, out of the way so Colt could have it all. A rage, colder and harder than anything I'd ever felt on the battlefield, settled deep in my bones. They weren't just a dysfunctional, ungrateful family anymore. They were a criminal enterprise. And I was going to dismantle it. The evidence was in hand. Now it was time to call for backup. The next morning, I returned to the house one last time. The 48-hour deadline was a ticking clock in the back of my mind, and I had to move. The air inside was stale with betrayal. Every object held a memory, now tainted. My mission was simple: extract essential personal items and abandon the field. I worked with a cold, detached efficiency, packing a few boxes with photo albums, my high school yearbooks, and some books I couldn't bear to leave behind. Each item I touched felt heavy, not with its own weight, but with the weight of what I had lost. I was taping up the last box when a shadow fell across the driveway. I looked up, my body tensing instinctively. Standing on the lawn, his hands in his pockets, was Mr. Burke from across the street. Mr. Burke was a neighborhood fixture, a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was a man of few words, known for his perfectly manicured lawn and the American flag he raised every single morning. In all the years I'd lived here, we'd exchanged little more than polite nods and waves. My first thought was that my father had sent him over to make sure I was leaving. He walked across the street, his steps slow and deliberate. His eyes, though old, were sharp and missed nothing. "Headed out, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He used my rank, not my name. It was a sign of respect, and it caught me off guard. I tried to keep my voice steady, professional. I didn't want his pity. "Just moving some things out for a while, Mr. Burke." He looked at the small pile of boxes, then at the sprawling house behind me, and then back at my face. He saw right through the lie. "I heard Pedro last night," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "Shouting from the porch. The whole block probably heard him." He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. It's a damn shame. His simple, honest words breached my defenses in a way no sympathy could have. He wasn't pitying me. He was angry for me. He saw the injustice. We've watched you grow up, Milan, he continued, his voice softening slightly. We saw you out here, year after year. I saw you on that roof in the fall, patching the shingles before the first snow. I saw you mowing this lawn every summer while your brother was off chasing God knows what in New York. We all saw you shoveling this driveway after every blizzard, making sure your folks could get their car out. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. We know who really took care of this house, Milan. Don't you ever doubt that. And that's when the dam broke. For the first time in 2 days, I felt the hot sting of tears welling in my eyes. They weren't the tears of a victim, but the tears of a soldier who had been holding a defensive line, alone, for far too long, only to finally see reinforcements arrive. It was the overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief of being seen, of being validated. I quickly wiped a tear away with the back of my hand, embarrassed by the show of emotion. As if on cue, another figure emerged. Mrs. Jensen from next door, a sweet woman who always had a smile and a wave, was walking toward us, holding a plate covered in aluminum foil. I saw you out here and thought you could use this, she said, her voice warm and kind. She peeled back the foil to reveal a pile of still warm, gooey chocolate chip cookies. The smell was the scent of every safe and happy childhood home that wasn't mine. For your strength, dear. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She just set the plate down on one of the boxes and wrapped her arms around me in a firm, motherly hug. It was a simple gesture, but it was more warmth and unconditional support than I had received from my own mother in 30 years. I hugged her back, burying my face in her shoulder for a brief second, breathing in the scent of kindness. We're so proud of you, Milan, she whispered, patting my back. Always have been. When she pulled away, she gave my arm a gentle squeeze and went back to her house, leaving the plate of cookies like an offering of peace. I stared at it, a lump forming in my throat. This was the family my heart had always yearned for. Not one of blood, but one of choice and community. Mr. Burke watched the exchange with a knowing look. Good people, he murmured. He then looked at my uniform from the day before, which I had left folded in my car. You know, he said, there's an organization, run by vets, called The Mission Continues. Their whole purpose is to help soldiers find ways to keep serving in their communities when they come home. He paused, letting the words sink in. Soldiers like you always know how to serve, no matter where you are. It's in our blood. That service, that dedication, that's your real value. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. His words were a direct counterstrike to my father's dismissal of my life's work. He was reminding me of my core identity, of the honor that no one could take from me. He prepared to leave, but stopped and turned back, his expression serious. He looked me straight in the eye, not as a neighbor, but as one veteran to another. In the Marine Corps, we have a code. We don't leave our own behind. Same goes out here, he said, his voice firm with conviction. You're one of us. That house, he gestured with his chin, that's just wooden nails. This, he tapped his own chest. This is where loyalty lives. He reached out and put a strong, weathered hand on my shoulder. Whatever you need, you call. You need a witness. You need a hand moving. You just need someone to listen. My door is always open. This whole neighborhood has your back. It wasn't just an offer of help. It was a pledge. It was a promise of allegiance from a man who understood honor better than my own father ever would. It was the moral authority I needed, the green light to proceed. My plan wasn't just my own anymore. It had the backing of a community that saw the truth. Phase 2. Fortify alliances, complete. He gave my shoulder a firm squeeze and then walked back across the street, leaving me standing in the driveway with a few boxes of my past and a plate of warm cookies that felt like the future. I was no longer a lone soldier on a hopeless mission. I had a fire support base, and now I was ready to advance. Phase 2 was complete. The neighborhood was my fire support base, Now, it was time for Phase 3, asset extraction. This wasn't about petty revenge. It wasn't about smashing dishes or slashing tires. This was a strategic withdrawal of resources. I had furnished their lives with my labor and my combat pay. Now, I was liquidating those assets. I didn't search for a standard moving company on Yelp. I made one call to a number I'd gotten from Mr. Burke. The company was called Semper Fi Movers, a veteran-owned and operated business. A man with a voice that sounded like gravel in a coffee grinder answered, "Gunny's Movers, how can I help?" I didn't say, "I need to move some furniture." I spoke his language. "This is Sergeant Duffy. I need a team for a rapid asset extraction, effective this afternoon. Mission window is 3 hours. Requirements are speed, efficiency, and minimal footprint." There was a moment of silence on the line, and then a low chuckle. He understood perfectly. "Roger that, Sergeant. Alpha Team will be at your coordinates at 1400 hours. They're the best." At precisely 1400, a large moving truck pulled up to the house. The man who stepped out of the driver's side was built like a refrigerator, with the word Marines tattooed in bold letters down his forearm. He and his two-man crew were all vets. He walked up to me, looked me in the eye, and gave me a crisp nod. "Team lead." "Where's the manifest, Sergeant?" I handed him a clipboard. On it was a detailed list, cross-referenced with a floor plan of the house I had sketched from memory. Every item was an asset I had purchased, with receipts and bank statements to prove it. Living room, one 75-inch Samsung television, one Sonos sound system. Dining room, entire Crate and Barrel dining set, table, 8 chairs. Kitchen, Whirlpool washer and dryer. Garage, Honda generator. The list went on. It was everything that had transformed this house from a decaying structure into a comfortable home. "Understood," he said, glancing at the list. "Consider it done." His team moved with a level of precision that was almost beautiful to watch. There was no wasted motion, no shouting. They were a well-oiled machine, flowing through the house and systematically removing every item on my list. My parents emerged from the back of the house, drawn by the noise. They stood in the kitchen doorway, their faces masks of stunned disbelief. They watched, speechless, as the large-screen TV was carefully unmounted from the wall. They watched as the dining room table where they had disowned me was expertly disassembled and carried out the door. The house was being methodically dismantled around them. My mother was the first to break. She stumbled out onto the front lawn, her face streaked with tears, and approached the team lead. "Please," she wailed, putting on a performance worthy of an Oscar. "You don't understand. She's taking everything. She's our daughter, and she's taking everything away from us." The Marine, who was currently directing the removal of the washing machine, didn't even flinch. He gave my mother a flat, emotionless look, then glanced over at me. I met his gaze and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. It was all the confirmation he needed. He turned back to my mother. "Ma'am, my only orders are on this manifest. Please step aside." My father was next. He stormed out onto the porch, his face purple with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is family property. You can't just steal it." I remained perfectly still, my arms crossed. I didn't raise my voice. I let his rage crash against my calm. "No," I said, my voice cold and clear, devoid of any emotion. "This is property purchased with the salary of a United States Army soldier, and that soldier is currently redeploying said property to a more secure location." My words, clinical and quasi-legal, stopped him cold. He had no response. He was used to dealing with a daughter he could emotionally manipulate. He didn't know how to handle a sergeant executing a planned operation. He just stood there, sputtering, as the last of the furniture was loaded onto the truck. In less than 2 hours, it was over. The team lead handed me back the clipboard, every item checked off. "Mission complete, Sergeant." "Thank you," I said, shaking his firm hand. "Excellent work." "Anytime," he said with another nod, and then they were gone. I stood in the driveway as the truck drove away. The silence it left behind was absolute. I walked back into the house one last time. It was an empty shell, hollowed out. The only things left were their old, worn-out furniture from decades ago. Their footsteps echoed on the bare hardwood floors as they wandered aimlessly through the empty rooms. This wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of truth. I had simply restored the house to the state it would have been in without my contributions. I had revealed the reality of their situation. The house was now worth exactly what they had invested in it. Nothing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was just one phase, one battle in a larger war. But it was a victory. It was the first time I had taken back control. The first time I'd shown them that their actions have consequences. If you've ever had to take back your own power, even when it was the hardest thing to do, hit that like button and show your support. And I want you to comment with a single word that describes how this moment feels. Reclaimed. I walked out the front door and sat down on the top step of the porch, the cool concrete a comfort against the turmoil inside me. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty street. I wasn't leaving, not yet. Phase 3 was complete. But I knew the enemy's prize asset, their golden child, was still en route. I knew Colt was on his way, and I would be waiting. I waited on that porch as the Montana sky bled from orange to a deep, bruised purple. The air grew cold, but I didn't move. I was a sniper in a hide, perfectly still, my senses dialed to maximum. I was waiting for the target to enter my field of fire. An hour later, a pair of headlights cut through the dusk. A shiny black Ford Mustang, a rental, of course, far too flashy for this neighborhood, pulled into the driveway with a self-important crunch of gravel. The engine cut and the driver's door opened. Colt. He stepped out like he was stepping onto a red carpet. He was wearing expensive jeans, a trendy jacket, and an arrogant smirk that I'd wanted to wipe off his face since we were kids. He grabbed a stylish leather suitcase from the passenger seat and sauntered toward the house, whistling a tuneless melody, the conquering hero returning to claim his kingdom. He didn't even glance in my direction as he brushed past me on the porch. He pushed the front door open and strode inside. The whistling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. I could hear the faint echo of his footsteps on the bare wood floors. Then, a roar of pure, entitled rage. "What the hell?" His voice bounced off the empty walls. "Milan! You bitch! What did you do?" I stood up slowly and walked inside, closing the door behind me. I found him standing in the middle of the cavernous living room, spinning in a slow circle, his face a mask of fury and confusion. I stood by the doorway, my arms crossed, my posture relaxed, but ready. At attention. He finally locked his eyes on me. "You did this! Where is everything? Where's my stuff?" "I'm not sure what you mean by your stuff, Colt," I said, my voice calm and even. It was the voice I used to de-escalate situations before they turned violent. I merely recovered my assets, the things I paid for. I let my eyes drift around the empty space. This house is now a hollow shell, Colt, a lot like your promises. That hit a nerve. He lunged toward me, his face turning a blotchy red. "You have no right. This is my house. My house. Mom and Dad gave it to me." "Did they?" I asked, my voice still dangerously quiet. This was the moment. The kill shot. I reached into the inner pocket of my field jacket and pulled out the folded sheaf of papers I'd taken from the attic. I didn't hand them to him. I let them fall from my hand, scattering across the floor between us. The top page, the loan agreement, landed face up. "Really?" I said, my voice laced with ice. "Because the bank seems to think this house belongs to me, or at least the debt does." He stared at the papers, his bravado starting to crack. He recognized the letterhead of the First Montana Bank. I took a deliberate step forward. "Do you recognize this signature, Colt?" I pointed to the sloppy forgery of my name at the bottom of the page. They took out a $60,000 second mortgage in my name, using my military papers and my perfect credit score. I let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. "That's called bank fraud, Colt. A federal felony." The color drained from his face. The self-satisfied king was gone. replaced by a pale, terrified boy. The smirk was gone, his mouth hanging open slightly. He started to stammer, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. I didn't know anything about that. You'll have to explain that to the federal investigators, I said, pressing the attack. My voice was relentless, a cold, hard instrument of truth. And since I'm an active duty soldier, this little stunt of yours, it can be elevated to a military-level investigation. They take it very, very seriously when a soldier's honor is used to commit a crime. I saw his gaze flicker toward the large picture window that faced the street. I followed his eyes. Outside, under the glow of a streetlight, two figures were standing on the sidewalk. Mr. Burke, his arms crossed, and another neighbor, Henry King, also a veteran. They weren't doing anything, just standing, watching, a silent honor guard. I turned my head back to Colt. The whole neighborhood knows the truth, Colt, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. They saw me on the roof. They saw me with the shovel. They know who bled for this place. I took one final step toward him, closing the distance. You have nowhere left to run. That's when he broke. Completely. The illusion of the successful artist, the favored son, shattered into a million pieces. All that was left was a pathetic, cornered coward. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at the papers on the floor. He glanced again at the two silent sentinels outside. He let out a strangled sob. Then, in a final act of cowardice, he lunged forward and shoved me hard. It wasn't an attack. It was a desperate attempt to clear a path. I stumbled back, my training allowing me to keep my balance. He didn't press on. He scrambled to grab his suitcase, his hands fumbling with the handle. He turned and fled, tripping over the front step on his way out, his stylish jacket catching on the doorframe. He scrambled to his feet and ran to his rental car, throwing the suitcase in the back before peeling out of the driveway with a squeal of tires. I didn't watch him go. He was no longer the objective. I stood there for a moment in the echoing silence of the empty house, the scattered papers on the floor, the only evidence of the battle. Then I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled to a single contact and pressed call. It rang twice. Jess Riley. Jess, I said, my voice steady and clear. It's Milan. I walked over to the window and looked out at Mr. Burke and Henry King. They both gave me a slow, solemn nod before turning and heading back to their homes. Phase 3 complete, I said into the phone, my eyes on the taillights of Colt's car disappearing down the street. Prepare for Phase 4, full-scale, legal assault. The day of the hearing arrived with the cold, clear light of a Montana morning. Phase 4, full-scale, legal assault. This was the final objective. I didn't wear a civilian suit to the Missoula County Courthouse. I made a deliberate choice. I wore my Army service uniform, the formal dress blues. The jacket was perfectly pressed, the brass on my belt buckle gleamed, and the medals on my chest, small, neat rows of color, told a story of their own. I wasn't here today as a daughter. I wasn't here as a victim. I was here as Sergeant Milan Duffy of the United States Army, whose name and honor had been compromised. I walked through the courthouse doors with my head held high, my footsteps echoing on the marble floors. I saw them on a bench across the hall. My family. They looked defeated, haggard and diminished under the fluorescent lights. My father's usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen slump in his shoulders. My mother stared at a fixed point on the floor, twisting the strap of her purse. And Colt? He wouldn't look at me. He was wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit right, a boy playing dress-up for his own execution. We took our places. Me and Jess on one side, my family and their weary-looking, court-appointed lawyer on the other. I sat ramrod straight, my hands folded on the table in front of me. I felt a tremor of nervousness, a soldier's adrenaline before a mission. I silenced it by repeating a line from the soldier's creed in my head. A mantra I'd used in far more dangerous places than this. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. Jess was magnificent. She was no longer just my friend. She was a warrior in her own element. She laid out the case with the cold, irrefutable logic of an intelligence officer briefing a general. There was no drama, just facts. She presented Exhibit A, the fraudulent second mortgage document. The signature was a clumsy, almost insulting forgery. She presented Exhibit B, years of my bank statements, showing consistent, large-sum transfers to my parents' account for the original mortgage, for utilities, for property taxes. It was a clear, undeniable pattern of support. Then she called her only witness, Mr. Burke. He walked to the stand, a fellow veteran, his posture still straight despite his age. He spoke in a clear, steady voice, telling the court how he'd watched me spend my leaves not partying, but reshingling the roof in the biting autumn wind, shoveling the driveway after blizzards, and maintaining the property while Colt was nowhere to be seen. This is not a simple family dispute, Your Honor, Jess concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. This is a calculated, systematic exploitation of an active duty soldier by her own family. They didn't just take her money, they weaponized her service. The opposing lawyer's defense was weak, pathetic. He tried to paint me as an ungrateful absentee daughter who had abandoned her aging parents. He made it sound as if my service to the country was a selfish hobby. Then he made his fatal mistake. He called my father, Pedro, to the stand. Pedro swaggered up, a flicker of his old, belligerent self returning. His lawyer asked him a series of softball questions, trying to portray him as a concerned father. But then Jess got her turn. Mr. Duffy, she began, her tone deceptively gentle. Why did you feel it was appropriate to demand your daughter, a combat engineer who had just returned from a deployment, vacate her home with 48 hours' notice? My father puffed out his chest. Colt is the son. He needed to establish himself. She's a soldier. She's used to moving around. Jess paused, letting the statement hang in the silent room. So, in your mind, her service, her sacrifice, made her less entitled to a home. And then he said it, the words that sealed their fate. He looked at Jess with pure, unadulterated arrogance and said, "It was her duty." A hush fell over the courtroom. The air crackled. Even his own lawyer winced. It wasn't an excuse, it was an indictment. He saw my sacrifice not as a gift, but as an obligation he was entitled to exploit. The judge, a stern-faced woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, had been listening intently. Now she leaned forward, her gaze fixed on my father. For the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion on her face, a deep, profound anger. She let the silence stretch for a long moment before she spoke, her voice low and cutting. She addressed my family, but her words felt like they were for me. The sacrifice of a soldier is not a bank account for you to make withdrawals from at your convenience, she said, each word landing like a gavel strike. Her honor is not a commodity for you to leverage when you mismanage your own lives. Her duty is to her country, not to funding your irresponsibility. She looked down at her notes, then back up at them. The end had come. The judgment of this court is as follows, she announced. The fraudulent loan of $60,000 is hereby declared null and void. Sergeant Duffy's name is to be expunged from all associated records immediately. I felt a breath leave my body I didn't know I was holding. Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice unwavering, the defendants, Pedro, Grace, and Colt Duffy, will be held liable for all of Sergeant Duffy's legal fees. They will also pay a sum in compensation for emotional distress. My mother let out a small strangled gasp. Colt looked like he was going to be sick. But the judge wasn't finished. She delivered the final, fatal blow. And due to the voiding of this illegal second mortgage, the First Montana Bank is now authorized to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the property to reclaim its initial investment. This court is adjourned. The finality of the gavel's crack echoed in the silent room. It was over. They had lost everything. Their greed had devoured itself, and the house, the very thing they had tried to steal, was the ultimate price. I didn't feel a rush of joy. I didn't feel triumphant. As I stood up, the crisp fabric of my uniform rustling, all I felt was a profound, hollow emptiness. It was the quiet that comes after the battle is over, a heavy, draining, and total sense of relief. The war was won. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding Montana sunlight. The victory didn't feel like a celebration. There were no triumphant cheers, no fists pumped in the air. There was only a vast, hollow silence where a family used to be. It was the silence of an amputation. Necessary, life-saving, but the phantom limb still ached. Jess put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Sergeant?" I nodded, the motion feeling heavy. "I will be." We went to a quiet diner, the same one where I had drawn up my battle plan on a napkin. It felt like a lifetime ago. I ordered a black coffee and just sat there, watching the steam rise from the cup. My phone, which had been on silent, began to vibrate against the table. A text message, then another, and another. The aftershock had begun. I didn't have to look. I knew who it was from. For the next few hours, my phone became a weapon aimed at me. The messages were a chaotic barrage of manipulation, a textbook cycle of abuse. First came the guilt tripping from my mother. "How could you do this to us? You're killing your father. We have nowhere to go." Then, the pathetic, self-pitying pleas from Colt. "You ruined my life. I had plans. You've always been jealous of me." And finally, the pure, undiluted venom from my father. "You are no daughter of mine. You are a poisonous snake. Don't you ever contact us again." Followed, almost immediately, by a text from my mother. "Your father doesn't mean that. Please call us Milan. We can fix this." There was no remorse in any of their words. Not a single, "We were wrong," or "We're sorry." They weren't sorry for what they did. They were just sorry they got caught. They were angry that their ATM had finally been shut down. Later that week, I got a call from Finn. He spoke in a low, careful voice, like someone delivering a casualty report. "The foreclosure went through, Milan. The house sold at auction for way under market value. Just enough to cover the bank's losses." "And them?" I asked, my own voice a monotone. "They moved into a small rental apartment over on the west side, near the rail yard," he said. "And, well, word is that Colt is working shifts loading trucks at a warehouse." The empire built on my sacrifice had crumbled into dust. The successful artist was now a manual laborer. The proud homeowners were now renters in a cramped apartment in a rougher part of town. There was a grim satisfaction in the news, but it was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. It wasn't joy. It was just the logical conclusion. A few days later, a letter arrived at the small, furnished apartment I'd rented. It was from Mr. Burke. Inside there wasn't a long, emotional message, just a small, neatly folded piece of paper. On it, in his firm, old-fashioned handwriting, was a quote from Winston Churchill. "If you are going through hell, keep going." Tucked inside the note was a small check for $50. The memo line read, "For a good meal." That simple gesture broke through the numbness. Tears I hadn't shed in the courtroom, tears I hadn't shed on the worst days of my deployment, finally fell. He hadn't tried to fix it. He hadn't offered pity. He had simply acknowledged the battle and offered a ration for the march ahead. This was family. This was honor. That night, my phone rang. The caller ID was Mom. I let it ring for a long time, the sound shrill in the quiet of my apartment. Finally, I took a deep breath, the way you do before stepping into the cold, and answered. "Milan!" Her voice was thick with tears, but they were tears of self-pity, not repentance. "Milan, please. We're family." Those two words, "we're family," had been the cage I'd lived in my entire life. They were the justification for every sacrifice, every injustice, every time I was told to be the bigger person. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of Missoula. I felt a strange calm settle over me. "No, Grace," I said, and hearing my own voice say her first name was a shock. It was the voice of an equal, not a daughter. A family doesn't do what you did. A family is a fire you gather around for warmth, not one you're thrown into to be consumed. A family protects each other. I paused, letting the finality of my next words sink in. "You chose your side. I wish you luck." I pressed the red icon on the screen before she could reply. My new apartment was quiet. The furniture I'd fought for, my couch, my dining table, my bed, stood around me like silent, loyal soldiers. They were symbols not of a broken home, but of a battle won. I realized in that moment that my peace was worth more than any toxic blood connection. My phone buzzed again. A new text from my mother. "You will regret this for the rest of your miserable life." I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt nothing at all. It was just noise from a distant, irrelevant signal. Slowly, methodically, I opened my contacts. I found my father's name, Pedro. I tapped the screen and selected Block this caller. A small pop-up asked me to confirm. I pressed Block contact. 1 down. Next, Grace. Block this caller. Block contact. 2 down. Finally, Colt. Block this caller. Block contact. 3 down. With each tap of the screen, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of self-preservation. It was me, finally, securing my own perimeter. I looked around my quiet, peaceful apartment. Mission complete, I whispered to myself. 6 months passed. The snows of a Montana winter had come and gone, washing the world clean. In that time, I had established my new command post. It was a small second-floor apartment on the quiet, tree-lined south side of Missoula, a place that was entirely my own. The first thing I did when I moved in was paint the walls. I chose a warm, calming shade of gray. I spent a weekend carefully taping the edges and rolling on the color, and with every stroke, I felt like I was painting over the past, creating a clean slate. I didn't hire anyone. My own hands did the work. These walls were mine. Slowly, I began to fill the space. The furniture I had extracted, my rescued assets, found new homes. The dining table that had once been a stage for my eviction now hosted meals I chose to eat. The sofa, which had sat in a living room thick with tension, was now a place of comfort. I arranged them with the same precision I would use to set up a forward operating base. Everything had a purpose. Everything was secure. On one wall, I hung a collection of framed photos. There were no pictures of my biological family. Instead, there were images of my real one, my squad in Afghanistan, covered in dust and grinning after a successful mission. A picture of my first platoon, young and proud at graduation. Each face was a reminder of loyalty, of a bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. My rescued furniture and my cherished photos weren't reminders of the war I'd just fought at home. They were my medals. My apartment wasn't large, but it was my fortress, my sanctuary, a place where I was absolutely safe. The definition of family, I learned, has nothing to do with blood. It has everything to do with choice. One Saturday, Jess and Finn made the drive down from Helene to visit. They showed up at my door with 2 large pizzas from a local place called Biga Pizza and a 6-pack of craft beer from Kettle House Brewing Company. "We come bearing gifts, Sergeant," Finn said with a grin, holding up the beer like a trophy. We sat on the couch, my couch, and ate pizza straight from the box, talking and laughing for hours. They didn't ask me about my parents or Colt. They didn't treat me like a fragile victim they had to handle with care. They just treated me like Milan. We talked about their work, about the ridiculous politics at the bank, about a new hiking trail Jess had discovered. It was normal. It was easy. It was real. Looking at them, these 2 people who had stood by me without question, who had offered their help not out of obligation but out of genuine friendship, I felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost took my breath away. This was family. The one you choose. The one that chooses you back. A few weeks later, an official email from the Army landed in my inbox. My heart did a familiar little jump. It was a notification of promotion. I was now Staff Sergeant Duffy. Reading the words, I felt a surge of pride that was clean and uncomplicated. It was an accomplishment that was mine alone, earned through my own merit, untainted by anyone else's expectations or manipulations. But there was more. Attached to the promotion were new orders. I was being reassigned. My next duty station, Grafenwehr, Germany. My role, an instructor at the Combat Engineer School, training the next generation of young soldiers. A year ago, the thought of moving again, of being a wanderer, would have felt like a confirmation of my father's cruel words. You're a soldier, you move around, you don't need a home. But now the words had lost their power. I didn't see the orders as a sentence to a nomadic life. I saw them as an opportunity, a promotion, a chance to lead, to teach, to shape others. Germany wasn't an exile, it was a destination. That night, I thought about the compensation money that had been deposited into my bank account. It felt wrong to just spend it on myself. It felt like blood money. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I contacted the administration at my old high school in Missoula. I used a portion of the funds to establish a small perpetual scholarship. I called it the Duffy Honor Scholarship. It wasn't for the star athletes or the academic geniuses. It was for students who were choosing to go into the technical trades: welding, mechanics, engineering, the builders, the fixers, the ones who, like me, knew how to make things work. The pain they had caused me would now pave a path for someone else. It was my new legacy. This morning, I woke up before the sun. I made a fresh pot of coffee and poured it into a thick ceramic mug, the one with my unit's insignia, a castle tower with a lightning bolt stamped on the side. I walked out onto my small balcony. The air was crisp and cool. Across the valley, the sky was just beginning to turn a soft, pale blue over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The world was quiet, still, holding its breath before the dawn. I leaned against the railing, the warmth of the mug seeping into my hands. I was no longer haunted by the ghosts of what a family was supposed to be. I was no longer carrying the weight of a name that had been used against me. I was just me. I am Staff Sergeant Milan Duffy, commander of my own life, and my future, just like the Montana sky stretching out before me, was vast, clear, and wide open. My story had an ending, but I know for many of you, your battle might just be beginning. If my journey has given you even a small piece of strength, then it was worth telling. Remember that you have the right to define your own family, to draw your own lines, and to be the commander of your own life. Thank you for listening. If you believe this story can help someone else find their own strength, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and reclamation. You are not alone in your fight.